Welcome to MENA Dialogues, a series of interviews with leading scholars, artists, and writers produced by the Middle East and North African Studies program at Northwestern University.
This episode of MENA Dialogues features a conversation with Wendy Pearlman about her book, We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. Based on interviews she conducted with more than 300 Syrian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and the United States. The book is a collection of first-hand testimonials that chronicles the Syrian conflict exclusively through the stories and reflections of people who have lived it. Pearlman is the Koldyke Outstanding Teaching Associate Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University and a core faculty member of the university's Middle East and North African Studies program. She is the author of 2 previous books, Occupied Voices, Stories of Everyday Life from the Second Intifada, published in 2003, and Violence, Nonviolence, and the Palestinian National Movement, published in 2011. Her next book is Triadic Coercion, Israel's Targeting of States that Host Non-State Actors. This co-authored study is forthcoming in October of 2018. The host, Brian Edwards, is Crown Professor in Middle East Studies, Professor of English, Comparative Literary Studies, and American Studies, and Founding Director of the Middle East and North African Studies program at Northwestern. He is the author of Morocco Bound, Disorienting America's Maghreb from Casablanca to the Marrakech Express, published in 2005, and After the American Century, The Ends of U.S. Culture in the Middle East, published in 2016. Beginning in July of 2018, Edwards will be the Dean of Tulane University's School of Liberal Arts. This conversation took place on June 7, 2018, at Northwestern.
Wendy Pearlman, welcome to MENA Dialogues. This is the first time that we have done a MENA Dialogues with one of our own colleagues in the MENA program, and it is so special to do it. Thank you for taking the time to do it.
Thanks for having me here.
We're so thrilled about the success and the reach of your book, We Crossed the Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria, which came out last June, 2017. Now we're in 2018, and the book will come out in August in paperback. So congratulations on that.
Thanks.
And you know, I want to spend the time in this dialogue talking about the process of researching the book, of doing the interviews, as well as some of the choices you made in writing it. Because I know, having been your friend and colleague over the years that you were compiling this, that you really thought about not only the crucial subject that you're covering, but about the ways in which narrative technique and strategies of research could come together in making and showing the world something new and something important about one of the greatest crises of the century, of course. So first, could you just tell me and tell us how you came about the topic itself? You know, it was a slight shift from some of your earlier work, and how you came to write about Syria.
Yeah, so I had worked on the Palestinian National Movement and Palestinian politics for about a decade. That was the topic of my first book, which I wrote in the course of graduate school, and my second book, that was a revision of my dissertation. And I was just finishing that second book. In fact, the page proofs, I think, were going in when the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings began. So I was ready for a new topic. I was ready to switch gears and do something new. And then this thing happened, which in many ways is probably for across disciplines, but certainly for political science focusing on the Middle East, has been the event we're still grappling with, its causes, its effects, how it's transformed the region. So this book is really a product of the Arab uprisings. So I watched the first year of the uprisings from afar, from here in Evanston or from Chicago, and was just captivated, I mean, I think as most people were, with these shows of people's power, of people going out into the streets. And I was especially interested in the emotional, psychological, personal dimension, especially what it took for people to go out and protest, who maybe never imagined protesting. How do people muster the courage to go out and say no despite such risks, despite real danger? And there was nowhere where this came to the fore more dramatically, perhaps, than in Syria. So at the time, people were saying Syria is a kingdom of silence, people might protest everywhere else in the region, but not Syria. So when Syrians defied all of that, and they also went out to protest, I really wanted to know how, and I wanted to know why, and wanted to know what it felt like. So it was from a background in studying social movements, on the one hand, but just being captivated by the Arab uprisings on the other, that drove me to the question of how to gather personal stories of protest. And that's how I came to the story of Syria. So I began doing interviews in 2012. By that time, it was already too dangerous, or at least I felt like it was too dangerous for me to go inside Syria and have frank conversations about politics and protest inside Syria. So I began to interview Syrians who'd fled the country as refugees. And I began the summer in Jordan in 2012, and 2013 returned to Jordan, moved on to Turkey, and for the next 5 years, until today even, I continue to gather these open-ended interviews with Syrians. So it began with an interest in protest and the Arab uprising, but as the Syrian story evolved from protest to repression, militarization of an uprising, war, and then became a refugee crisis, I continued to interview Syrians, continued to gather these long, open-ended testimonials, and try to trace how people's lives had evolved, and try to trace what I could discover about politics via personal stories, just the stories of how people have lived all of these events. And that's how I came to collect this large body of interview material and then slowly put it together in a book format.
Oh, it's remarkable. I mean, you know, as you talk about it, there's so many ways in which you're tapping into either unexpected responses to Syrian silence, which is something we used to talk about in the past, and the inability to have a voice, but also some of the disciplinary questions. Let's take the latter ones first. I mean, was it, I mean, within political science circles to take this approach, to use interview techniques, to follow individuals and voices, did you come against any disciplinary kind of pushback, or was that unusual terrain for a political scientist to be exploring?
Yeah, it's really unusual terrain. This is on the margins of political science, which in many ways the sort of reason for being a political science is focusing on causal explanations of variables, of effects, of hypothesis testing, of gathering data in order to test theories about why things are the way they are. And the truth is, I began this project with something of the same mind frame. My initial question was, what explains participation in high-risk dissent? What brings people to go and protest? In my first wave of interviews, that was my main motivation. But I tried to go about that question by just asking people in general, what does this uprising mean to you? Did you protest? Did you not protest? Why? How? What was it like? Figuring if I gathered these long, open-ended stories about the protest movement, I'd be able to find in there some causal explanation, some theory, some hypothesis about explaining what it is to bring people to do this puzzling behavior, participate in high-risk political dissent. And as I began to gather the stories, I became convinced that the stories themselves, these open-ended narratives, people just talking about their lives, were so rich and so beautiful and so expressive that in some ways I felt like it would be a disservice to treat them like data with which to test a hypothesis. Right. And the truth is, I began with that, thinking, let me gather data to test and build a theory. And over time became convinced that the stories were more than just data for a framework. They deserve to be engaged with on their own terms. They were worth just listening to because they also explain more than one question. People were talking, some of them, about why they participated in high-risk dissent, but they were also talking about the nature of authoritarianism, the nature of social relations under a regime like the regime of the Assads, about identity, about poverty, about family relations. People's stories, once they got going, went into many different directions. And as I gathered them, really felt like it would be confining and constraining and ultimately losing a lot of the richness to force it into a more social scientific framework. So in a lot of the other work I do, I still buy into that social science and I work it. And I think there is a time and a place and a setting and a kind of questions and kind of data in which theory, social science theory and social science methodology can extract more understanding from raw material. And in this case, I thought this raw material actually did best when it was just sort of presented. So then became the question of what's the best way to present that material once I decided I didn't want to use it for my own theory building.
So before we get to that, because that's of course incredibly interesting question, you know, the response to the book has been enormous, and people have, and reviewers have, and commentators have responded to the ability, the otherwise unusual ability to hear the voices of Syrians. And the book has been reviewed on the front cover of the New York Times book review. You had the cover of Time Magazine International with some of the parts of the argument here. But going back to the point you made about the political science argument about why it is that, or the hypothesis that drove you, or the question that was driving you about why people get involved in protest, is there something kind of hidden within these narratives? Is there some answer to that helps answer that question for us from a political science perspective? I mean, did you discover, or does it just lead you to rehypothesize why it is that people get involved in protest along the way?
Yeah, in the end, I think there are many different answers, and that might be one of the reasons also I thought I couldn't boil down the stories I was gathering, the sort of the rich diversity of the lived experience into a single argument, because there were lots of reasons. I found lots of different patterns of what it was that brought someone, especially to, use the expression that was used, break the barrier of fear in order to participate in protest. Many people talked about, and I have a separate academic article in which I try to theorize some of these questions of what brings people to protest. Many people talked about the experience of watching somebody else protest first, and that there was something in that experience of seeing somebody else break the barrier that then triggered them to do the same thing. Maybe it was a sense of seeing somebody else experience the kind of euphoria of speaking voice and saying, I want to do that too. People sometimes talked about being almost driven, almost like by the subconscious, of finding their body move and pressing them without making it as a clear decision. One thing I always found to be funny or interesting was I often heard sort of gender dynamics of a man who would say he'd see another man protest and say, what, is he a man and I'm not a man? I'm too afraid? No, I need to prove my masculinity by going and protesting as well. And then I'd hear the same thing when a man said he saw a woman go and protest and think, what? I'm too afraid? She's protesting? No way, I'm going to join. There were other people who were triggered to protest in response to repression and response to the huge prices they saw being paid by their neighbors and their friends. And that's why often if there was a protest and someone was killed and the next day there was a funeral, 20, 100 times the amount of people would go out to that funeral, whether it was a sense of moral duty to their friends and neighbors, whether it was a sense of respect for the dead, whether it was a sense that this regime has lost all legitimacy because it has fired on unarmed people. And now I've crossed the line. So there was a response to violence and repression on the part of the government as well. So there are lots of different triggers. But for most people with whom I spoke, there was a question of feeling discontent with the political system, being critics, wanting to go out and say no, wanting to go out and say anything and say, I have a voice. But the barrier to that was a combination of fear, unknown about the consequences, worry about what price they would pay, worry about what price their family might pay with retribution. So there were real costs, real risks, and real dangers. And something had to tip the balance for people to think that whatever is the possible cost of going out and protest, the benefit of speaking one's voice, of standing with one's neighbors, of trying to affect change were greater and came to outweigh the costs at that particular moment.
So let's talk about that now. You've taken all these incredible interviews, and I do want to talk more about that process. But you just mentioned another aspect that people have really held on to with this book and found quite interesting, which is the way in which it's presented. On the one hand, it's a series of interviews with names, and it seems straightforward. It's very elegant, and as we look at it more, there's a certain story that starts to come about, or a narrative thread that moves through the series of interviews. First, maybe you can talk to us about how you came to draw those threads, or if you moved the interviews around, and what the process of assembling them was.
Yeah, so I did interviews with over 300 people over the course of, I guess, 4 or 5 years, when I had to stop and actually begin moving it into preparing the actual manuscript. And so one process was doing the interviews. The next was getting all the interviews transcribed and translated. And I luckily had funds that I could hire people to help me with that, because otherwise it would take century.
Just stay here.
Yeah.
So you did the interviews in which language and how what was the process like?
Great. So doing the interviews themselves was the question. First, the question was finding the interviewees, and I used with sort of a snowball method of one person would introduce me to somebody else, would introduce me to someone else, and I would try to use as many different entry points as I could to these different social networks, which essentially consisted of asking everyone I ever came into contact with a favor of, could you introduce me to someone? And that meant asking Syrians, could you introduce me to other Syrians? It meant asking Turks, do you happen to know any Syrians? It asked Jordanians, do you know any Syrians in your neighborhood?
The sociologist snowball effect. Yeah,
essentially asking everyone in any country, do you have anybody that you could introduce me to? And then that person would usually introduce me to a whole realm. And sometimes I would do interviews in somebody's house and a neighbor would come by and join the interview. Or I would do an interview with somebody and said, you should really go see so-and-so down the street, and we'd walk down the street. So one thing would lead to another, people in the same family or friends or neighbors or acquaintances and so forth. So just keep asking for favors and interview as many people as possible. I did most of the interviews in Arabic, but also did some in English. It was always up to the interviewee. Some people's English was fantastic, and it was quite easy for them to do that. But
and explain for people who don't know exactly how Arabic works. This is which dialect were you using, and was there a variety of dialects?
The people I was speaking with were all Syrians, but there are a variety of regional dialects. So people from Aleppo is different than people from Homs and people from Damascus.
And by the way, you had worked in Palestinian dialects before. How much of a learning curve was it to move into Syrian dialect?
I think that my own Arabic is this hodgepodge salad stew of, I started studying Arabic in Morocco. I studied classical Arabic for many years. I did a year of study at Casa in Cairo. I spent many years over the years in the Palestinian territories.
The Great Center for Arabic Study abroad, Casa, for years.
So my own Arabic is this hodgepodge of stuff. And I think that most people with whom I speak see that I'm clearly a foreigner, that my Arabic is a little bit all over the place. And I imagine there's kind of an instinctive sort of cleaning it up, so that when a Homsi speaks with me, he's not speaking as Homsi as he is with other Homsis. Someone is sort of intuitively making the language a bit more intelligible for an outsider.
More of an Arabiya Mutawassita or something coming into the middle.
Exactly. So there might have been things I didn't catch here and there.
But wait, let's not take away from the incredible talent that you have in languages. You're being very modest.
No, thanks.
And I want to ask you about that. But I imagine that you're picking up different dialectical words and so on like that throughout the process. Yes.
And there, the big thing is audio recording the interviews, because I'd always ask people for their permission to interview or to audio record, and most people gave consent to that, which was valuable in so many ways. One is that if I didn't catch every word in the moment, I could go back and listen as many times as I needed to. It was all there. Another was that it allowed me to focus in the interview on that one-on-one experience of looking somebody in the eye and losing myself in the story, and just focus on listening as opposed to focusing on writing down. And then lastly, no matter how quickly you take notes, so much is lost. Sure. You might be able, in taking notes, catch what people say, but not always catch how they say it. And I think that's the beauty of the book and these stories, is that people express things in ways that are often so beautiful, that are literary, that are poetic, that the stories themselves, the bare experiences are shocking and eye-opening, but the way that people make sense of them and putting that into language for themselves, I wanted to capture that word for word.
Was this usually a one-on-one conversation? Was there also a research assistant with you, or other people? Was it ever collective, or was it usually just one-on-one?
It was usually one-on-one, and I felt like those were every interview setting brings its own advantages and disadvantages. The most intimate experience is when it's one-on-one, in which I think some people really open up.
There's something in many of these interviews that is almost, I don't want to say therapeutic, but there's a relationship between interviewer and interviewee that can remind you of expressing and working through trauma.
Yeah,
I don't know if this is how it felt at the time to you, but
sometimes I did have people say that to me at times. Especially, there were times I talked to people and they said, I've never told my story, or I've never told my story in this way. And you really think, when would you have? When do any of us sit down and narrate a life with the first person, sitting down with another person? That's just something you don't do in your everyday life. But when somebody comes and they say, I really want to hear your story. Will you tell it to me? It gives a license for people to speak in ways they just might not have before. So for some people, I think that was therapeutic. I mean, it may be the first time especially they did it. I think with now things have gotten more complicated.
Yeah.
Now, years later, sometimes there's a sense of fatigue of, well, I'm going to tell my story again.
Right.
There might be a sense of futility of what use does it do to tell my story. And there's also pain in reliving those moments, both the painful moments and increasingly even the most happy, euphoric moments in comparison to what some people are living now, and especially reliving for many people, the highlight of their stories was 2011 and participating in protests and what the revolution meant. And they look now at what Syria is, and to go back and remember even those beautiful days are painful. But at the time when I was gathering the stories, especially in the beginning when there was a real enthusiasm to speak and a newness of speaking, and also for many people, telling their story was a political act.
Right.
If part of Assad rule was keeping people silent, saying you don't have a voice, you don't matter, to say I have a truth, and it's not the truth that whatever the propaganda is coming out of the regime, I'm not a terrorist, I'm not fomenting sectarian hatred, I want freedom, I want dignity, and here's what I've done. It was a political act to tell that, and I was able to sort of participate in that as a political process. So I think in many ways doing the interviews was a very positive in that
Now,
sense, especially at a particular moment.
Now, before we go over to narrative, I mean,
Yeah.
it strikes me that since this is a conflict that has attracted a lot of journalists as well, and that some of the process of doing interviews can be journalistic, that you are coming at this from quite a different angle, even though the work has been picked up often in news sources or like Time, as we said, or through reviews and major news sources. So how do you think it's different from a journalistic approach? And is that because of your ability with the languages and not having interpreters, or is it the questions that drive it? Have you reflected on that in the process of doing that over the years?
No, that's interesting because I haven't ever had experience as a journalist. I'm not quite sure how to compare it, except what mostly comes to my mind is chiefly I had more time. I didn't have the pressure of a deadline the next day. I didn't have the pressure of writing a 300, 400 word piece. I didn't have the pressure of only tapping into what the news cycle was of the moment. So I could go much more slowly. I could afford to have these totally open-ended interviews in which I didn't have an agenda that I need to get a quote on a specific event, that I could just say, tell me about your life. What has this conflict been like for you? And I could ask that again and again, every day for 5 or 6 years with people again and again, over and over, and just have the luxury of discovering what came out. And journalists would have written 600 stories by then on really specific themes, perhaps as demanded by their editors and so forth. So I had a slowness that allowed me to just kind of discover and just see what would come out.
Now, in journalism and in the coverage of the Syrian conflict, debacle, crises, some have talked about a certain fatigue among readers, or a Syria fatigue, that there's only so much bad news or so much that people who are not directly implicated can take. And yet your book, and there seems to be something to that, and I'm kind of curious as you reflect on the ways in which a certain narrative becomes, moves from narrative to formula. We know this story, and we know where it's going, and it may be something we've come across in other parts of the world, other crises. Yeah. How did that haunt you, or did you think about it in the process of working on the book? Was that a challenge, and was it something you were self-conscious about?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, when I began the project, there really wasn't the Syria fatigue. Syria was still a protest movement. It wasn't even a war, no less a catastrophe and a humanitarian crisis and a refugee crisis. So in the beginning, that wasn't so much of an issue. And then it came to be over time. I think people are numbed to tragedy. I mean, how many pictures have people seen that are absolutely horrific, and it's just, oh, another picture of rubble, another picture of someone carrying the corpse of a child. I mean, it's one thing after another, and people begin to tune out. And whether it's because people know, or in some ways I think that it's disempowering. I can come across people over and over again who actually don't really understand Syria, and they say, I don't even know what this conflict is about. Who is fighting whom, how it got so bad. I see this news, I know that something horrible is happening, but I'm almost feel unempowered by the sheer quantity of news and the relentless pace of the news, and I don't even know where to begin to get enough context to make sense of it, so I'm just going to kind of withdraw. So whether you know it all and it becomes secondhand nature, or you don't know it at all and you don't feel like you don't even know how to engage, either way it has the effect of people just not engaging. So I don't know to what degree I was consciously thinking of that, but in some ways it's a challenge for anybody writing about Syria, is how do you break through that? And I guess in some ways I really was thinking on both elements. How do I break through for people who have heard it all again, all before? How do I show them something, try to show them something new, to show it in a different light that reaches them in a different way? And at the same time, for the second part of the audience is people who feel overwhelmed and not even sure what this whole conflict is about. How do I offer something to say, here's enough basic context, let me walk you through the history so that you have the tools to feel like you can engage better with the news than you might otherwise. And tried to pitch the book in a way to almost straddle those kind of two different audiences and two contradictory goals. One thing I'm not sure to what degree it was conscious, but came out in the process of doing the book, was also an effort to try to create empathy, to try to create a situation in which the average American reader, who cannot possibly imagine being Syrian, cannot imagine being a refugee, cannot imagine being living an experience of war and enduring barrel bombs or chemical weapons, how to create empathy, help them bridge that gap, to try to imagine what it's like to be in Syrian shoes, to try to ask him or herself, what would I do if I were there? So they do not seem like foreign people that we can forget about, but people that could be you, could be me, and that I should feel more sense of solidarity and even a sense of kind of humanitarian obligation towards this crisis. So along the way, I picked, in the process of choosing which excerpts of, because when I finally transcribed, it was hundreds of thousands of words, and this is something like a 55,000 word book, what went in. Along the way, tried to choose these everyday details of life that I hoped someone could connect with. Describing a body torn to pieces is something your average American can't imagine. But for example, there's one story, or a passage from a mother in Aleppo that talks about leaving Aleppo, and the night before she left, and she was not sure if she and her kids would get out alive, and wrote on a piece of paper the names and phone numbers of her name and the kids' names and a phone number, and put them in their pockets, thinking that if they were killed, somebody would at least know the identity of their children. So for most American parents, you can't imagine the thought of that. But most American parents, your parent, I'm not, can imagine writing a name on your kid's thing so the shirt doesn't get lost at camp, or writing your name on the kid's lunch bag or something. That everyday parental duty of having to name a parental thing is something that I found many parents read that and they say, oh, I just wrote my son's name on his folder this morning. It's a moment of connection that can help you try to imagine. Now imagine if you were a mother in Aleppo. So those were in a million different ways, I looked for those everyday details that can create a kind of universal human connection. I don't know if that's enough to break through the Syrian fatigue, but it's, I think, a way of chipping at it.
See, this is, this is the place where I find the ways in which you bring together the disciplines so fascinating, because when you come to this book, and while you're working on this book, I kept thinking of, here's a political scientist using kind of anthropologist techniques.
Yes.
But in that description, this is literary. This is a moment of literary kind of universality, the particular, the particular yields to a sort of universal sort of truth. Um,
So it shows you all the ways I'm dabbling in things I don't understand, I've
love
never been trained, in
dabbling.
which I
I
have
love
no
it.
business.
This is a
half
little-
anthropologist, half literary scholar, and all I was trained in was political science. So it's, but there's something, maybe there
Yeah.
is, I mean, it sort of represents what we're trying to do here in
Yeah.
our program of ways that different disciplines can enrich each other. And there's so much to learn from the way other people seek to produce knowledge and understanding.
No, it's absolutely a fantastic. It's there's like an onion-like effect to this, not the periodical, but more
Right,
like you're
right.
peeling away layers,
Yeah.
and it starts to yield much more than one thought on the methodological side. And absolutely, as far as it's an advertisement for an interdisciplinary approach,
Yeah.
it's not the one you would have expected, but it turns
Yeah.
out to be. So let's end then with some reflections then on, I mean, the ways in which the Syria, what you were calling, the sort of fatigue of the story, also plays into two kinds of global narratives or even formulas. I'm thinking of cinema in that sense, and one is various non-Middle Eastern global crises, whether they're refugee or cataclysmic, whether it's Rwanda, different points in time, various conflicts in Africa on the one hand. On the other hand, the Syrian crisis from 2011 has played into or crossed over with maybe Orientalist types of narratives about the Middle East or the Arab or at times the Muslim.
Yeah.
And so it's a complicated kind of story, or a complicated way in which it intersects with these narrative formulas. How do you see that? I mean, is what was called the Orientalist narrative meaningful in the Syrian case? I mean, it's certainly with the election of Donald Trump, the story about Syria slightly changed in terms of American conversations. Became more and more affiliated with the Muslim or the danger of the countries that were on a certain kind of list. Is that fair to say, or is it much more of a local kind of story?
Well, I mean, I think that all stories can be read on different levels, and politics is always local, but national, transnational, international as well. But I mean, the fundamental narrative of this book, which is the narrative I heard again and again and again with Syrians narrating their lives, is fundamentally a story about individuals and a population wanting freedom, seeking dignity, wanting a government that was more accountable to its people, wanting some sense of social justice, fed up with corruption, fed up with unfairness, wanting to walk into government offices and being treated with respect rather than being treated with active disrespect. I mean, it's the most sort of basic stories about individuals and power, about citizenship and rights. It's a story of people coming together as communities to fight for a larger cause, about sacrifice, about family, and ultimately paying an enormous price by a political system, by a government, by a regime that was willing to do anything to stay into power. And then what people do when faced with this enormous violence and repression by power holders that don't want to give it up and are willing to commit crimes in order to stay there.
Has the book had, it's new still, but have you had a sense of international responses to the book, whether in the region, whether there's interest in translations or in the region or through the Time Magazine International article? Is it resonating in different sorts of ways elsewhere?
Yeah, so the publisher's trying to seek international translations. So far there are two. We're getting a translation into Japanese, which is interesting, and a translation into Arabic.
Right.
So that's working, and they're trying to get others. But often the response they're getting from publishers at this point in time is precisely Syria fatigue. We don't want another Syria book. There's not a market for it.
Interesting.
So they are hearing a Syria fatigue bit often from other publishers around the world to which they're trying to market it. For me, the most important response, of course, has been for Syrians, and from Syrians. When Syrians read the book, I'm always on pins and needles, because ultimately I want to know, do you feel like it honors your experience? Do you think this resonates? Do you read it and feel like you saw yourself in it? And for me, one of the most well, there have been a couple different types of responses that I find tremendously gratifying. One has been, I remember a Syrian colleague read it and said, I lived these events and I'm beginning to forget some of the details. I forgot that, we used to do that and we used to say that, which to me said, it's really important that this is documented, and not just for the world to understand Syria, but many Syrians themselves don't necessarily have the time or the resources to write down their stories. Some do, and those works are so tremendously valuable. They're not just writing their stories, they're creating film and theater and music and dance and every kind of medium. Syrians are expressing themselves and telling their own stories, and that's amazing, and those are the works we should really be engaged with. But a lot of people don't have the time or the resources to write them, and this is one other work to contribute to this big pool of works to document that story so it's not forgotten. Another kind of response from another Syrian colleague who said, I read this and there's nothing new here. She's like, this is all known. And I was like, phew, that means I got the story right. It's not everybody's story, and there's an important caveat. This is overwhelmingly the story of people who are critical of the regime, who supported the uprising, who participated in it. It does not represent the full point of views of those who are loyal to the regime. It doesn't represent the stories of those who remain in Syria, since these are only the stories of those who left. But it's a big part of the population, and one whose voices deserve to be listened to, and I've done my best to document it in ways that people say, yeah, that's my story. And other Syrians have said things like, I talk to my American friends or my foreign friends and don't know what to tell them, don't know where to begin to express what our lives were like. And this book has tried to assemble it all in one place in a format that's relatively easy to read, that's accessible, that's brief, that can be an entry point for those who don't know much about Syria, and maybe even a book that Syrians can give their non-Syrian friends to say, start with this, and then you'll kind of know where I'm coming from.
Well, Wendy, you've written a book that's both extremely important for today, for 2017, 2018, and the moment, but also a book that really answers some very important questions as how the disciplines come together, so that will last far beyond, I hope, this crisis and wherever it's going. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much.
During your book tour and through and your teaching and your work for Northwestern to sit down and talk about it. It's a great pleasure and an honor to talk to you about the book.
Oh, the pleasure and the honor is mine. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.